Origin, nature, and object of the ancient mysteries, abridged from Bishop Warburton's Divine Legation of Moses with. It is proper to premise that the author uniformly refers to the works of the writers which he quotes, and generally gives the passages in the original language in which they were written. His quotations from the Aeneid, the Metamorphoses of Apuleius, and some other works given in the Latin language are here rendered into English. A few Greek passages in his work are also given in translation, and all Greek terms are put in Roman characters for the benefit of the general reader. An abstract of the author's remarks, introductory to his treatise on the mysteries, is first given as follows. So inseparable, in antiquity, were the ideas of law-giving and religion, that Plutarch, speaking of the preference of atheism to superstition, supposes no other establishment of divine worship than what was the work of the legislator. How much happier would it have been, says he, for the Carthaginians had their first lawgiver been like Critias or Diagoras, who believed neither gods nor demons, rather than such a one as enjoined their public sacrifices to Saturn. But here it will be necessary to remind the reader of this previous truth, that there never was in any age of the world, from the most early accounts of time to this present hour, any civil police nation or people who had a religion, of which the chief foundation and support was not the doctrine of a future state of rewards and punishments, the Jewish people only accepted. This, I presume, our adversaries will not deny. Mr. Bayle, the indulgent foster father of infidelity, confesses it in the fullest manner, and with the utmost ingenuity, all the religions of the world, whether true or false, turn upon this grand pivot, that there is an invisible judge who punishes and rewards after this life the actions of men, both of thought and deed. From thence, it is supposed the principal use of religion is derived, and thinks it was the utility of that doctrine which set the magistrate upon inventing a religion for the state. It is the principal motive that incited those who invented it. The Egyptians were the first people who perfected civil policy, and established religion. They were the first too, who deified their kings, lawgivers, and public benefactors. This was a practice invented by them, who in process of time taught the rest of the world their mystery. The attributes and qualities assigned to their gods always corresponded with the nature and genius of the government. If this was gentle, benign, compassionate, and forgiving, goodness and mercy were most essential to the deity, but if severe, inexorable, captious, or unequal, the very gods were tyrants, and expiations, atonements, lustrations, and bloody sacrifices composed the system of religious worship. Gods partial, changeful, passionate, unjust, whose attributes were rage, revenge, and lust, such as the souls of cowards might conceive, and formed like tyrants would believe. The first step the legislator took was to pretend a mission and revelation from some god, by whose command and direction he had framed the policy he would establish. In a word, there is hardly an old lawgiver on record but what thus pretended to revelation, and the divine assistance. The universal custom of the ancient world was to make gods and prophets of their first kings and lawgivers. Hence it is that Plato makes legislation to have come from God and not from man. Aristotle, in his maxims for setting up and supporting a tyranny, lays this down for one to seem extremely attached to the worship of the gods, for that men have no apprehension of injustice from such as they take to be religious, and to have a high sense of providence. This principle is beginning to be understood and acted upon by some of our leading patriots in the American Republic, nor will the people be apt to run into plots and conspiracies against those whom they believe the gods will in turn fight for and support. And here it is worth noting that anciently tyrants, as well as lawgivers, gave all encouragement to religion, and endeavored to establish their irregular wills, not by convincing men that there was no just nor unjust in actions, but by persuading them that the privilege of divine right exempted the tyrant from all moral obligation. Porphyry quotes an express law of Draco's concerning the mode of divine worship. Let the gods and our own country heroes be publicly worshipped according to the established rites, when privately, according to every man's abilities, with terms of the greatest regard and reverence, with the first fruits of their labors, and with annual libations. Andicides quotes another of Solon, which provides for the due and regular celebration of the Eleusinian mysteries. Athenaeus does the same. And how considerable a part these were of divine worship, and of what importance to the very essence of religion, we shall see hereafter. The second step the legislators took to propagate and establish religion was to make the general doctrine of a providence, with which they prefaced and introduced their laws, the great sanction of their institutes. Thus, Zaleucus begins his preface, every inhabitant, whether of town or country, should first of all be firmly persuaded of the being and existence of the gods, which belief he will be readily induced to entertain when he contemplates the heavens, regards the world, and observes the disposition, order, and harmony of the universe, which can neither be the work of blind chance nor of man. These gods are to be worshipped as the cause of all the real good we enjoy. Every one, therefore, should so purify and possess his mind as to have it clear of all kinds of evil, being persuaded that God is not honored by a wicked person, nor acceptably served, like miserable man, with sumptuous ceremonies, or taken with costly sacrifices, but with virtue only, and a constant disposition to good and just actions. And much in the same fashion does Corandus introduce his laws. In imitation of this practice, Plato likewise and Cicero both prefaced their laws with the sanctions of religion. And though these two great men were not, strictly speaking, lawgivers in form, yet we are not to suppose that what they wrote in this, science, was like the dreams of the sophists, for the amusement of the idle and curious. They were both well practiced in affairs, and deeply conversant in human nature, and they formed their speculative institutes on the plan, and in the spirit and views of ancient legislation, the foundation of Plato's being the Attic Laws, and the foundation of Cicero's the 12 Tables. Plato makes it the necessary introduction to his laws to establish the being and providence of the gods by a law against sacrilege, and he explains what he means by sacrilege in the following words: either the denial of the being of the gods, or, if that be owned, the denial of their providence over men, or, thirdly, the teaching that they are flexible and easy to be cajoled by prayer and sacrifice. Plutarch, in his treatise of Isis and Osiris, remarks that in Crete there was a statue of Jupiter without ears, the Cretans judging it fit that he who is the ruler and lord of all things should hear no one. See Taylor's translation, Jam, p. 248. And afterwards, it is not of small consequence that what we hear reason about the gods should by all means be made probable, as that they are, and that they are good, and that their concern for justice takes place of all other human considerations. For this, in our opinion, seems to be the noblest and best preface that can be made to a body of laws. In compliancy with this declaration, Cicero's preface to his laws is conceived in the following terms: let our citizens then be, first of all, firmly persuaded of the government and dominion of the gods, that they are the lords and masters of the world, that all things are disposed by their power, direction, and providence, and that the whole race of mankind is in the highest manner indebted to them, that they are intimately acquainted with everyone's state and condition, that they know what he does, what he thinks, with what disposition of mind, and with what degree of piety he performs the acts and offices of religion, and that, accordingly, they make a distinction between the good and evil. And then follow the laws themselves, the first of which is conceived in these words: let those who approach the gods be pure and undefiled, let their offerings be seasoned with piety, and all ostentation of pomp omitted. The god himself will be his own avenger on transgressors. Let the gods and those who are ever reckoned in the number of celestials be worshipped, and those likewise whom their merits have raised to heaven, such as Hercules, Bacchus, Aesculapius, Castor, Pollux, and Romulus. And let chapels be erected in honor to those qualities by whose aid mortals arrive thither, such as reason, virtue, piety, and good faith. Deleg. Lib. 2, c. 8. Institution of the mysteries. The next step the legislator took was to support and affirm the general doctrine of a providence, which he had delivered in his laws, by a very circumstantial and popular method of inculcating the belief of a future state of rewards and punishments. This was the institution of the mysteries, the most sacred part of pagan religion, and artfully framed to strike deeply and forcibly into the minds and imaginations of the people. I propose, therefore, to give a full and distinct account of this whole matter, and the rather because it is a thing little known or attended to, the ancients who wrote expressly on the mysteries, such as Melanthius, Menander, Hicesius, Sotades, and others, not being come down to us, so that the modern writers on the subject are altogether in the dark concerning their origin and end, not excepting Mursius himself, to whom, however, I am much indebted for abridging my labor in the search of those passages of antiquity which make mention of the Eleusinian mysteries, and for bringing the greater part of them together under one view. To avoid ambiguity, it will be proper to explain the term. Each of the pagan gods had, besides the public and open, a secret worship paid unto him, to which none were admitted but those who had been selected by preparatory ceremonies called initiation. This secret worship was termed the mysteries. But though every god had, besides his open worship, a secret likewise, yet this latter did not everywhere attend the former, but only there, where he was the patron god, or in principal esteem. Thus when, in consequence of that intercommunity of paganism, which will be explained hereafter, one nation adopted the gods of another, they did not always take in at the same time the secret worship or mysteries of that god. So, in Rome, the public and open worship of Bacchus was in use long before his mysteries were admitted. But on the other hand, again, the worship of the strange god was sometimes introduced only for the sake of his mysteries, as, in the same city, that of Isis and Osiris. Thus stood the case in general. The particular exceptions to it will be seen in the sequel of this dissertation. The first and original mysteries, of which we have any sure account, were those of Isis and Osiris in Egypt, from whence they were derived to the Greeks, under the presidency of various gods. As the institutor thought most for his purpose, Zoroaster brought them into Persia, Cadmus and Inachus into Greece at large, Orpheus into Thrace, Melampus into Argos, Trophonius into Boeotia, Minos into Crete, Cinyras into Cyprus, and Erechtheus into Athens. And as in Egypt they were to Isis and Osiris, so in Asia they were to Mithras, in Samothrace to the mother of the gods, in Boeotia to Bacchus, in Cyprus to Venus, in Crete to Jupiter, in Athens to Ceres and Proserpine, in Amphissa to Castor and Pollux, in Lemnos to Vulcan, and so to others in other places, the number of which was incredible. But their end, as well as nature, was the same in all, to teach the doctrine of a future state. In this, Origen and Celsus agree, the two most learned writers of their several parties. The first, minding his adversary of the difference between the future life promised by Christianity and that taught in paganism, bids him compare the Christian with what all the sects of philosophy, and all the mysteries, among Greeks and barbarians taught concerning it, and Celsus in his turn, endeavoring to show that Christianity had no advantage over paganism in the efficacy of stronger sanctions, expresses himself to this purpose. But now, after all, just as you believe eternal punishments, so do the ministers of the sacred rites and those who initiate into and preside in the mysteries, and that nothing very heterodox was taught in the mysteries concerning a future state, I collect from the answer Origen makes to Celsus, who had preferred what was taught in the mysteries of Bacchus on that point, to what the Christian religion revealed concerning it. Lib. I. 4th. p. 167. They continued long in religious reverence. Some were more famous and more extensive than others, to which many accidents occurred. The most noted were the Orphic, the Bacchic, the Eleusinian, the Samothracian, the Cabiric, and the Mithriac. Euripides makes Bacchus say, in his tragedy of that name, that the orgies were celebrated by all foreign nations, and that he came to introduce them among the Greeks. And is not improbable, but several barbarous nations might have learned them from the Egyptians long before they came into Greece, the Druids of Britain who had, as well as the Brahmins of India, divers of their religious rites from thence, celebrated the orgies of Bacchus, as we learn from Dionysius the African. And Strabo, having quoted Artemidorus for a fabulous story, subjoins, but what he says of Ceres and Proserpine is more credible, namely, that there is an island near Britain, where they perform the same rites to those two goddesses as are used in Samothrace. But of all the mysteries, those which bore that name, by way of eminence the Eleusinian, celebrated at Athens in honor of Ceres, were by far the most renowned, and in process of time eclipsed, and, as it were, swallowed up the rest. Their neighbors round about very early practiced these mysteries to the neglect of their own. In a little time all Greece and Asia Minor were initiated into them, and at length they spread over the whole Roman Empire, and even beyond the limits of it. I insist not on those sacred and august rites of Eleusis, where from the remotest regions men come to be initiated, and we are told in Zosimus that these most holy rites were then so extensive as to take in the whole race of mankind. Aristides calls Eleusis the common temple of the earth, and Pausanias says, the rites performed there as much excelled all other rites instituted for the promotion of piety, as the gods excelled the heroes. How this happened is to be accounted for from the nature of the state which gave birth to these mysteries. Athens was a city the most devoted to religion of any upon the face of the earth. On this account their poet Sophocles calls it the sacred building of the gods in allusion to its foundation. Nor was it a less compliment St. Paul intended to pay the Athenians when he said, Ye men of Athens, I perceive that in all things ye are too superstitious. And Josephus tells us that they were universally esteemed the most religious people of Greece. Hence, in these matters, Athens became the pattern and standard to the rest of the world. In discoursing, therefore, of the mysteries in general, we shall be forced to take our ideas of them chiefly from what we find practiced in the Eleusinian. Nor need we fear to be mistaken, the end of all being the same, and all having their common original from Egypt, to begin with the general purpose and design of their institution. This will be understood by showing what they communicated promiscuously to all, to support the doctrine of a providence which, they taught, governed the world. They enforced the belief of a future state of rewards and punishments by all kinds of methods. But as this did not quite clear up the intricate ways of providence, they added the doctrine of a metempsychosis, or the belief of a prior state, as we learn from Cicero, and Porphyry, the latter of whom informs us, that it was taught in the mysteries of the Persian Mithras. This was an ingenious solution, invented by the Egyptian lawgivers, to remove all doubts concerning the moral attributes of God, and so, consequently, to establish the belief of his providence from a future state. For the lawgiver well knew how precarious that belief was, while the moral attributes of God remained doubtful and uncertain. In cultivating the doctrine of a future life, it was taught that the initiated would be happier in that state than all other mortals, that while the souls of the profane, at their leaving the body, stuck fast in mire and filth and remained in darkness, the souls of the initiated winged their flight directly to the happy islands and the habitations of the gods. This promise was as necessary for the support of the mysteries as the mysteries were for the support of the doctrine. But now, lest it should be mistaken, that initiation alone, or any other means than a virtuous life, entitled men to this future happiness, the mysteries openly proclaimed it as their chief business, to restore the soul to its original purity. It was the end and design of initiation, says Plato, to restore the soul to that state from whence it fell, as from its native seat of perfection. They contrived that everything should tend to show the necessity of virtue, as appears from Epictetus. Thus, the mysteries became useful. Thus, we seize the true spirit of them, when we begin to apprehend that everything therein was instituted by the ancients, for instruction and amendment of life. Porphyry gives us some of those moral precepts, which were enforced in the mysteries, as to honor their parents, to offer up fruits to the gods, and to forbear cruelty towards animals. In pursuance of this scheme, it was required in the aspirant to the mysteries that he should be of a clear and unblemished character, and free even from the suspicion of any notorious crime. To come to the truth, he was severely interrogated by the priest or hierophant, impressing him with the same sense of his obligation to conceal nothing, as is now done at the Roman confessional. As appears from the repartee which Plutarch records in his laconic apothegms of Lysander, when he went to be initiated into the Samothracian mysteries, he was required by the hierophant to confess every wicked act that he had committed during his whole life. Why initiation into these mysteries is called inquiring of the oracles will be seen afterwards. Hence it was that when Nero, after the murder of his mother, took a journey into Greece and had a mind to be present at the celebration of the Eleusinian mysteries, the consciousness of his parricide deterred him from attempting it. On the same account, the good emperor M. Antoninus, when he would purge himself to the world of the death of Avidius Cassius, chose to be initiated into the Eleusinian mysteries, it being notorious that none were admitted into them who labored under the just suspicion of any heinous immorality. This was originally a fundamental condition of initiation, observed in common by all the mysteries. During the celebration of the mysteries, they were enjoined the greatest purity and highest elevation of mind. When you sacrifice or pray, says Epictetus and Arrian, go with a prepared purity of mind, and with dispositions so previously disposed, as are required of you when you approach the ancient rites and mysteries. And Proclus tells us that the mysteries and the initiations drew the souls of men from material, sensual, and merely human life, and joined them in communion with the gods. Nor was a less degree of purity required of the initiated for their future conduct. They were obliged by solemn engagements to commence a new life of strictest piety and virtue, into which they were entered by a severe course of penance, proper to purge the mind of its natural defilements. Gregory Nazianzen tells us that no one could be initiated into the mysteries of Mithras till he had undergone all sorts of mortifying trials and had approved himself holy and impassible. The consideration of all this made Tertullian say that, in the mysteries, truth herself took on every shape to oppose and combat truth, omnia adversus veritatem, de ipsa verite constructa esse. And Austin, that the devil hurried away deluded souls to their destruction when he promised to purify them by those ceremonies, called initiations. The initiated, under this discipline, and with these promises, were esteemed the only happy men. Aristophanes, who speaks the sense of the people, makes them exult and triumph after this manner. On us only does the sun dispense his blessings. We only receive pleasure from his beams. We, who are initiated, and perform towards strangers and citizens all acts of piety and justice. And Sophocles, to the same purpose, life only is to be had there, all other places are full of misery and evil. Happy, says Euripides, is the man who hath been initiated into the greater mysteries, and leads a life of piety and religion, and the longer anyone had been initiated, the more honorable they deemed him. It was even scandalous not to be initiated, and however virtuous the person otherwise appeared, he became suspicious to the people, as was the case of Socrates, and in after times of Demonax. No wonder then, if the superior advantages of the initiated, both here and hereafter, should make the mysteries universally aspired to, and indeed they soon grew as comprehensive in the numbers they embraced, as in the regions and countries to which they extended. Men, women, and children ran to be initiated. Thus, Apuleius describes the state of the mysteries. Even in his time, there was an influx of a crowd of those who had been initiated in the sacred rites of the goddess, consisting of men and women of every degree and of every age, resplendent with the pure whiteness of linen garments. The pagans, we see, seem to think initiation as necessary, as the Christians did baptism. And the custom of initiating children appears from a passage of Terence to have been general. Nay, they had even the same superstition in the administration of it, which some Christians had of baptism, to defer it to the approach of death. So the honest farmer Trygaeus, in the Pax of Aristophanes, I must be initiated before I die. The occasion of this solicitude is told us by the scholiast on the rands of the same poet. The Athenians believed that he who was initiated and instructed in the mysteries would obtain divine honors after death, and therefore all ran to be initiated. Their fondness for it became so great that at such times as the public treasury was low, the magistrate would have recourse to the mysteries as a fund to supply the exigencies of the state. Aristeuton, says the commentator on Hermogenes, in a great scarcity of public money, procured a law that in Athens every one should pay a certain sum for his initiation. Everything in these rites was mysteriously conducted and under the most solemn obligations to secrecy. This obligation of the initiated to secrecy was the reason that the Egyptian hieroglyphic for them was a grasshopper, which was supposed to have no mouth. See Horapollo hieroglyph, lib 2, cap 55, which, how it could agree to our representation of the mysteries as an institution for the use of the people, we shall now endeavor to show. They were hidden and kept secret for two reasons. First, nothing excites our curiosity like that which retires from our observation and seems to forbid our search. Of this opinion you will find the learned Synesius, where he says, "The people will despise what is easy and unintelligible, and therefore they must always be provided with something wonderful and mysterious in religion, to hit their taste and stimulate their curiosity." And again, the ignorance of the mysteries preserves their veneration, for which reason they are entrusted to the cover of night. On these principles the mysteries were framed. They were kept secret to excite curiosity. They were celebrated in the night to impress veneration and religious horror. Euripides, in the Bacchantes, Act 2, makes Bacchus say that the orgies were celebrated in the night, because darkness has something solemn and august in it, and proper to fill the mind with sacred horror. And they were performed with variety of shows and representations to fix and perpetuate those impressions. Hitherto, then, the mysteries are to be considered as invented not to deter, but to invite the curiosity of the people. But, secondly, they were kept secret from a necessity of teaching the initiated some things, improper to be communicated to all. The learned Varro, in a fragment of his Book of Religions, preserved by St. Augustine, tells us that there were many truths, which it was inconvenient for the state to be generally known, and many things, which, though false, it was expedient, the people should believe, and that therefore the Greeks shut up their mysteries in the silence of their sacred enclosures. Now, to reconcile this seeming contradiction of supposing the mysteries to be instituted to invite the people into them, and at the same time to keep them from the people's knowledge, we are to observe that in the Eleusinian rites there were two mysteries, the greater and the less. The end of the less must be referred to what we said of the institutor's intention to invite the people into them, and of the greater, to his intention of keeping some truths from the people's knowledge. Nor is this said without sufficient warrant. Antiquity is very express for this distinction. We are told that the lesser mysteries were only a kind of preparatory purification for the greater, and might be easily communicated to all. That 4 years was the usual time of probation for those greater mysteries, in which, as Clemens Alexandrinus expressly informs us, the secrets were deposited. However, as it is very certain that both the greater and lesser mysteries were instituted for the benefit of the state, it follows that the doctrines taught in both were equally for the service of society, only with this difference: some without inconvenience might be taught promiscuously, others could not. On the whole, the secret in the lesser mysteries was some hidden rites and shows to be kept from the open view of the people, only to invite their curiosity, and the secret in the greater, some hidden doctrines to be kept from the people's knowledge for the very contrary purpose. For the shows common both to the greater and lesser mysteries were only designed to engage the attention and raise their devotion, but it may be worthwhile to inquire more particularly into the hidden doctrines of the greater mysteries, for so religiously was the secret kept that the thing seems still to lie involved in darkness. We shall therefore proceed cautiously and try, from the obscure hints dropped up and down in antiquity, ponderis alta terra e caligin merces, lay open things hidden in the deep earth and in obscurity, to begin with a passage of Clemens Alexandrinus. After these are the lesser mysteries, in which is laid the foundation of the hidden doctrines, and preparations for what is to come afterwards. But there was one insuperable obstacle to a life of purity and holiness: the vicious examples of their gods. Ego homuncio hoc non facerem, Terence Iun. Act 2, SCV Euripides puts this argument into the mouth of several of his speakers up and down his tragedies. Helen, in the 4th act of the Trojan Dames, says, "How could I resist a goddess whom Jupiter himself obeys?" Ion, in his play of that name, in the latter end of the 1st act, speaks to the same purpose. And in the 5th act of Hercules Furens, Theseus comforts his friend by the examples of the crimes of the gods. See likewise his Hippolytus, Act 2, SC 2, the learned and ingenious Mr. Seward, in his tract of the conformity between popery and paganism, has taken notice of a difficult passage in this tragedy, which he has very ably explained, on the system here delivered of the detection of polytheism in the sacred mysteries. When St. Austin had quoted the Ego homuncio hoc non facerem to show what mischief these stories did to the morals of the people, he makes the defenders of paganism reply that it was true, but then these things were only taught in the fables of the poets, which an attention to the mysteries would rectify. This the father cannot deny, but observes, however, that in the then corrupt state of the mysteries the remedy was become part of the disease. Nolo dicere illa mystica quam ista theatrica esse torpiora was the absolving formula whenever anyone was resolved to give a loose to his passions. And the licentious rites, in the open worship of their gods, gave still greater encouragement to these conclusions. Plato, in his Book of Laws, forbids drinking to excess, unless, says he, during the feast of Bacchus, and in honor of that god. And Aristotle, in his Politics, having blamed all lewd and obscene images and pictures, except those of the gods, which religion had sanctified. Now the mysteries professed to exact nothing difficult of the initiated, which they would not assist him to perform. It was necessary, then, to remedy this evil, which they did by striking at the root of it. So that such of the initiated as were judged capable were made acquainted with the whole delusion. The mystagogue taught them that Jupiter, Mercury, Bacchus, Venus, Mars, and the whole rabble of licentious deities were only dead mortals, subject in life to the same passions and infirmities with themselves, but having been, on other accounts, benefactors to mankind, grateful posterity had deified them, and, with their virtues, had indiscreetly canonized their vices. The fabulous gods being thus routed, the supreme cause of all things naturally took their place. Him they were taught to consider as the creator of the universe, who pervaded all things by his virtue and governed all by his providence. But here it must be observed that the discovery of this supreme cause was made consistent with the notion of local tutelary deities being superior to men and inferior to God, and by him set over the several parts of his creation. This was an opinion universally holden by antiquity, and never brought into question by any theist. What the Aporeta overthrew was the vulgar polytheism, the worship of dead men. From this time the initiated had the title of epopts, by which was meant one that sees things as they are and without disguise, whereas before he was called mystes, which has a contrary signification. But besides the prevention of vice, the detection of the national gods had another important use, which was to excite men to heroic virtue by showing them what honors the benefactors of nations had acquired by the free exercise of it. And this, as will be shown hereafter, was the chief reason why princes, statesmen, and leaders of colonies and armies all aspired to be partakers of the greater mysteries. Thus we see how what was taught and required in the lesser mysteries became the foundation of instruction in the greater. The obligation to a good life there made it necessary to remove the errors of vulgar polytheism here, and the doctrine of a providence taught previously in those, facilitated the reception of the sole cause of all things when finally revealed in these. Such were the truths which Varro, as quoted above, tells us it was expedient for the people to know. These two were the truths which the Pontifex Scaevola said were to be kept hid from the people. It is recorded in books that Scaevola, a very learned pontiff, argued that 3 kinds of gods had been hid. Such were the truths which Varro, as quoted above, tells us it was expedient for the people to know. These two were the truths which the Pontifex Scaevola said were to be kept hid from the people. It is recorded in books that Scaevola, a very learned pontiff, argued that 3 kinds of gods had been handed down to us, one by the poets, another by the philosophers, the third by the rulers of the state. The first kind, he says, is worthless, the second not suitable for commonwealths, because it contains certain things, the knowledge of which is prejudicial to the people. What, then, are those things which are prejudicial to the multitude? These, he says, that Hercules, Aesculapius, Castor, Pollux, are not gods, but were men who departed human life. Augustin de Cividale, lib. A 4th, cap. 27. He supposed, indeed, the error of vulgar polytheism to be so inveterate that it was not to be expelled without throwing society into convulsions. But Plato spoke out. He owned it to be difficult to find the Father and Creator of the universe, and, when found, impossible to discover him to all the world. Besides, there was another reason why the institutors of the mysteries, who were lawgivers, should be for keeping this truth a secret. They had, themselves, the chief hand in the rise of vulgar polytheism. They contrived it for the sake of the state, and to keep the people in awe, under a greater veneration for their laws. This polytheism the poets had depraved, by inventing or recording vicious stories of the gods and heroes which the lawgivers were willing to have stifled, and they were only such stories that, in their opinion, as may be seen in Plato, made polytheism hurtful to the state. That this accounts for the secret in the greater mysteries is no precarious hypothesis, raised merely on conjecture, I shall now endeavor to show. First, from the clear evidence of antiquity, which expressly informs us of these 2 particulars, that the errors of polytheism were detected, and the doctrine of the unity taught and explained in the mysteries. But here it is to be observed that when the ancients speak of mysteries indefinitely, they generally mean the greater. It hath been shown that the Grecian and Asiatic mysteries came originally from Egypt. Now of the Egyptian, St. Austin giveth us this remarkable account. Of the same nature too are those things which Alexander of Macedon wrote to his mother, as revealed unto him by one Leo, chief hierophant of the Egyptian mysteries, whereby it appeared that not only such as Picus, and Faunus, and Aeneas, and Romulus, nay Hercules, and Aesculapius, and Bacchus, the son of Semele, and Castor, and Pollux, and all others of the same rank, had been advanced from the condition of mortality into gods, but that even those deities of the higher order, The dii majorum gentium, those whom Cicero without naming seems to carp at, in his Tusculans such as Jupiter, Juno, Saturn, Neptune, Vulcan, Vesta, and many others, whom Varro endeavors to allegorize into the elements or parts of the world, were, in truth, only mortal men. It is not improbable, but this might be a name of office. Porphyry, in his fourth book of Abstinence, informs us that the priests of the mysteries of Mithras were called lions, the priestesses lionesses, and the inferior ministers ravens. For there was a great conformity in the practices and ceremonies of the several mysteries throughout the whole pagan world. And this conjecture is supported by a passage in Eunapius, which seems to say that it was unlawful to reveal the name of the Hierophant. In the modern degree of Masonry called Knight of the Eagle and Sovereign Prince of Rose Cross de Herodin, the aspirant solemnly promises on his honor never to reveal the place where he was received, who received him, nor those who were present at his reception. Also in the degree of Knight of Kadosh, when a reception is made, the great commander remains alone in the chapter with the candidate, and must be so situated that the latter cannot see him, as he is not to know who initiates him. But the priest being under great fears and apprehensions, while he was telling this, as conscious he was betraying the secret of the mysteries, begged of Alexander, when he found that he intended to communicate it to his mother, that he would enjoin her to burn the letter as soon as she had read it. I suppose this communication to his mother might be to let her understand that he was no longer the dupe of her fine story of Jupiter's intrusion and the intrigue of his divine original. For Eratosthenes, according to Plutarch, says that Olympias, when she brought Alexander on his way to the army, in his first military expedition, acquainted him in private with the secret of his birth, and exhorted him to behave himself as became the son of Jupiter Hammon. This, I suppose, Alexander might tell to the priest, and so the murder came out. To understand the concluding part, we are to know that Cyprian, who has also preserved this curious anecdote, tells us it was the dread of Alexander's power, which extorted the secret from the Hierophant. But this is a mistake. At least it is expressed inaccurately. What was extorted by the dread of Alexander's power was not the secret which the initiated had a right to, but the priest's consent that he should communicate the secret to another, which was contrary to the laws of the mysteries. All this well illustrates a passage in Lucian's Council of the Gods, when after Momus had ridiculed the monstrous deities of Egypt, Jupiter replies, "It is true that these are abominable things, which you mention of the Egyptian worship. But then, consider Momus, that much of it is enigmatical, and so, consequently, a very unfit subject for the buffoonery of the profane and uninitiated." To which the other answers, with much spirit, "Yes, indeed, we have great occasion for the mysteries, to know that gods are gods, and monsters monsters." But Tully brings the matter home to the Eleusinian mysteries themselves. "What," says he, "is not almost all heaven, not to carry on this detail any further, filled with the human race? But if I should search and examine antiquity, and from those things which the Grecian writers have delivered, go to the bottom of this affair, it would be found that even those very gods themselves, who are deemed the dii majorum gentium, had their original here below, and ascended from hence into heaven. Inquire to whom those sepulchres belong, which are so commonly shown in Greece. Remember, for you are initiated, what you have been taught in the mysteries. You will then at length understand how far this matter may be carried." He carries it further himself, for he tells us in another place that not only the Eleusinian mysteries, but the Samothracian likewise, and the Lemnian taught the error of polytheism, agreeably to this system, which supposes all the mysteries derived from the same original and constituted for the same ends. "What think you," says he, "of those who assert that valiant or famous or powerful men have obtained divine honors after death, and that these are the very gods now become the objects of our worship, our prayers, and adoration? Euhemerus tells us, 'When these gods died, and where they lie buried.' I forbear to speak of the sacred and august rites of Eleusis I passed by Samothrace, and the mysteries of Lemnos, whose hidden rites are here." The author comments at considerable length on an equivocal passage of Cicero, immediately following that here quoted, which, he says, Pluche, in his Histoire du Ciel, brings to prove that the purpose of the mysteries was not to explain the nature of the gods. His criticism goes to show the absurdity of this inference. He thus concludes his remarks: "It had hardly been worthwhile to take this notice of Pluche's interpretation of Cicero, had it not been evident that his purpose in it was to disguise the liberty he took of transcribing the general explanation of the mysteries, as delivered in the first edition of this volume, printed in 1738, into the second edition of his book, called Histoire du Ciel, printed in 1741, without the least notice or acknowledgement. That Mr. Pluche may have taken some of his ideas on the mysteries from the bishop's book is highly probable, but his work certainly possesses sufficient originality to prove celebrated in darkness, and amidst the thick shades of groves and forests." Here the author comments at considerable length on an equivocal passage of Cicero, immediately following that here quoted, which, he says, Pluche, in his Histoire du Ciel, brings to prove that the purpose of the mysteries was not to explain the nature of the gods. His criticism goes to show the absurdity of this inference. He thus concludes his remarks. It had hardly been worthwhile to take this notice of M. Pluche's interpretation of Cicero, had it not been evident that his purpose in it was to disguise the liberty he took of transcribing the general explanation of the mysteries, as delivered in the first edition of this volume, printed in 1738, into the second edition of his book, called Histoire du Ciel, printed in 1741, without the least notice or acknowledgement. That Mr. Pluche may have taken some of his ideas on the mysteries from the bishop's book is highly probable, but his work certainly possesses sufficient originality to prove the laborious investigations of the author, upon ground not previously occupied, to establish his fame as an ingenious, acute writer. In the disagreement of these authors in regard to the purport of the mysteries, the bishop has undoubtedly the advantage. He had evidently paid more attention to the subject than his contemporary. The abbé was deceived by Cicero, in whom he appeared to place implicit confidence, but he should have remembered that Cicero had been initiated into the Eleusinian mysteries, and therefore, no doubt, felt under restraint when speaking of them. Besides, he had 4 characters to sustain, that of a philosopher, a statesman, a lawyer, and an augur or priest, in the due support of which his popularity was, more or less, involved. A striking instance of the incompatibility with each other of the first and last mention of these characters is exhibited by him in the passage just quoted above and that before cited, in which he says, "Let the gods, and those who are ever reckoned in the number of the celestials, be worshipped, and those likewise whom their merits have raised to heaven, such as Hercules, Bacchus, Aesculapius, Pollux, and Romulus." Here the augur and the philosopher are at complete issue. 2 sentiments more directly in opposition could not be entertained, and it is surprising the bishop did not notice their total contrariety. What hath been said will let us into the meaning of Plutarch's hint in the following words of his tract concerning the ceasing of oracles. As to the mysteries, in whose representations the true nature of demons is clearly and accurately held forth, a sacred silence, to use an expression of Herodotus, is to be observed, thus far in detection of polytheism. With regard to the doctrine of the unity, Clemens Alexandrinus informs us that the Egyptian mystagogues taught it amongst their greater secrets. The Egyptian, says he, did not use to reveal their mysteries indiscriminately to all, nor expose their truths concerning their gods to the profane, but to those only who were to succeed to the administration of the state, and to such of the priests as were most approved by their education, learning, and quality. But, to come to the Grecian mysteries, Chrysippus, as quoted by the author of the Etymol, Magnum, speaks to this purpose. And Chrysippus says that the secret doctrines concerning divine matters are rightly called teletai, for that these are the last things the initiated should be informed of, the soul having gained an able support, and, being possessed of her desires, can keep silent before the uninitiated and profane. To the same purpose, Clemens, the doctrines delivered in the greater mysteries, are concerning the universe. Here all instruction ends. Things are seen as they are, and nature, and the things of nature, are given to be comprehended. Strabo, having said that nature dictated to men the institution of the mysteries as well as the other rites of religion, gives this remarkable reason for his assertion, that the secret celebration of the mysteries preserves the majesty due to the divinity, and, at the same time, imitates its nature, which hides itself from our senses. A plain intimation of the nature of the secret dot here Strabo takes in all that is said both of the gods and of nature in the 2 preceding passages from Chrysippus and Clemens, and shows that by nature is not meant the cosmical but theological nature. And had there been any ambiguity, he presently removes it, where, speaking of the different faculties exercised in the different rites of religion, he makes philosophy to be the object of the mysteries. Plutarch expressly says that the first cause of all things is communicated to those who approach the temple of Isis with prudence and sanctity, by which words he means the necessary qualifications for initiation. We find Galen intimating, not obscurely, that the doctrine of the divine nature was taught in those very mysteries. In his excellent tract of the use of the parts of the human body, he has. These words, the study, therefore, of the use of the parts, is not only of service to the mere physician, but of much greater to him who joins philosophy to the art of healing, and, in order to perfect himself in this mystery, labors to investigate the universal nature. They who initiate themselves here, whether private men or bodies, will find, in my opinion, nobler instruction than in the rites either of Eleusis or Samothrace. A clear implication that to lead men thither was their special business. But this seems to have been so well known to the learned in the time of Eusebius, that where this writer takes occasion to observe that the Hebrews were the only people whose object, in their public and national worship, was the God of the universe, he suits his whole expression, by one continued metaphor, to the usages of the mysteries. For the Hebrew people alone, says he, was reserved the honor of being initiated into the knowledge of God the Creator of all things, and of being instructed in the practice of true piety towards him. Where epopteia, which signifies the inspection of the secret, theopia, the contemplation of it, and demiurgos, the creator, the subject of it, are all words appropriated to the secret of the greater mysteries, I am persuaded this learned writer had his eye on some particular passage of scripture, probably on the 45th chapter of Isaiah, where the prophet, foretelling the conquests of Cyrus and the exaltation of his empire, apostrophizes the God of Israel in this manner: "Verily thou art a God that hidest thyself, O God of Israel the Savior." This was said with great propriety of the Creator of all things, the subject of the aperita or secret, in all the mysteries throughout the Gentile world, and particularly of those of Mithras, in the country which was the scene of the prophecy. That this is the true sense of this obscure passage appears from the following words of the same chapter, where God himself addresseth the Jewish people: "I have not spoken in secret, in a dark place of the earth. I said not unto the seed of Jacob, Seek ye me in vain." This was said to show that he was taught amongst them in a different way from that participation of his nature to a few select Gentiles, in their mysteries, celebrated in secret and in dark subterraneous places, which not being done in order to give him glory, by promoting his public and general worship, was done in vain. This naturally leads us to the explanation of those oracles of Apollo, quoted by Eusebius from Porphyry, the sense of which neither those ancient writers nor our Sir John Marsham seem rightly to have understood. The first is in these words: "The way to the knowledge of the divine nature is extremely rugged and of difficult ascent. The entrance is secured by brazen gates, opening to the adventurer, and the roads to be passed through, impossible to be described. These, to the vast benefit of mankind, were first marked out by the Egyptians." The second is as follows: "True wisdom was known only to the Chaldeans and Hebrews, who worshipped the governor of the world, the self-existent deity, with pure and holy rites." Marsham, supposing after Eusebius that the same thing was spoken of in both the oracles, says, "Certainly there can be no controversy that, as the religious belief of the Hebrews in one supreme being was esteemed very correct, the same belief by the Egyptians was equally estimable." And again, the truth is, Apollo was little consistent with himself, because in the one oracle, the Egyptians are said to be the first, and in the other, the Chaldeans and Hebrews, the only people who knew the true God. But they are perfectly consistent. They treat of different things, the first of the knowledge of the true God, and the second of his public worship. I will only observe that the frights and terrors to which the initiated were exposed gave birth to all those metaphorical terms of difficulty and danger so constantly employed by the Greek writers whenever they speak of the communication of the true God. Thomas Taylor, in a note to his translation of Jamblichus on the mysteries of the Egyptians, Chaldeans, and Assyrians, has rendered the foregoing oracle in verse, agreeable to the original, which he introduces as follows: "Most historians give the palm of antiquity to the Egyptians." And Lucian, in Lib. Dadea, says that the Egyptians are said to be the first among men that had a conception of the gods and a knowledge of sacred concerns. They were also the first that had a knowledge of sacred names. Conformably to this also, an oracle of Apollo, quoted by Eusebius, says that the Egyptians were the first that disclosed by infinite actions the path that leads to the gods. The oracle is as follows: "The path by which to deity we climb is arduous, rough, ineffable, sublime, and the strong massy gates, through which we pass in our first course, are bound with chains of brass. Those men the first who of Egyptian birth drank the fair water of Nilotic earth, disclosed by actions infinite this road, and many paths to God Phoenicians showed." This road the Assyrians pointed out to view, and this the Lydians and Chaldeans knew. Mr. Taylor has substituted Lydians for Hebrews, under a suspicion, as he says, that either Aristobulus, well known for interpolating the writings of the heathens, or Eusebius, had fraudulently inserted the latter. Means are taken to produce a like terror as spoken of above in candidates for royal archmasonry. They are advised that it will be necessary for them to pass through many trials and to travel in rough and rugged ways to prove their fidelity. The gates alluded to in the oracle of Apollo, which secure the entrance to the knowledge of the divine nature, are actually represented in the scenery of this degree. The true name of the Supreme Being is affected to be communicated, and in an address to him are the following expressions: "Teach us, we pray thee, the true reverence of thy great, mighty, and terrible name." Sent. In a German work by C. L. Reinhold, entitled The Hebrew Mysteries, or the Oldest Religious Freemasonry, it is affirmed that the whole Mosaic religion was an initiation into mysteries, the principal forms and regulations of which were borrowed by Moses from the secrets of the old Egyptians. Josephus, to the same purpose, says that high and sublime knowledge, which the Gentiles with difficulty attained in the rare and temporary celebration of their mysteries, was habitually taught to the Jews at all times, so that the body politic seems as it were one great assembly constantly kept together for the celebration of some sacred mysteries. The two great mysterious secrets of the Egyptians, it has been seen, were the existence of one supreme being, implying the error of polytheism, and a future state of rewards and punishments for acts committed in this life, the former of which only, it appears, was taught to the Jews. This is likewise communicated to the Masons of the Royal Arch degree, and is the only secret of the order. It is true, it was formerly enjoined upon the Jews to observe certain rites and ceremonies, which were then adapted to their peculiar circumstances, but which by the coming of Christ were rendered vain and useless, and were accordingly abrogated by the new dispensation. Notwithstanding, he obtained a more excellent ministry, by how much also he is the mediator of a better covenant, which was established upon better promises. For if that first covenant had been faultless, then should no place have been sought for the second. For instance, they were taught that a person became defiled by touching a human corpse, and the priests were absolutely prohibited from doing it. So, at interments of their dead, those who enter the cemetery wash their hands on retiring, bowls of water and napkins being furnished for the purpose. It is not lawful to touch human dead bodies when the soul has left them, since a vestige, image, or representation of divine life is extinguished in the body by death. But it is no longer unholy to touch other dead bodies, because they did not participate of a more divine life. To other gods, therefore, who are pure from matter, our not touching dead bodies is adapted, but to those gods who preside over animals and are proximately connected with them, invocation through animals is properly made. As to the mystery of obtaining remission of sins by the performance of certain mystic rites, as is customary with the Jews at this time, on what are called atonement days, the secret is fully known to Roman Catholic priests, and practiced upon by them with equal success. In a brief examination of the Reverend Mr. Warburton's Divine Legation of Moses are the following remarks. We have no profane records that can reach, by many hundred years, so high as the ancient state and constitution of the religion and priesthood of Egypt in and before the days of Moses. But as the Mosaic constitution itself was accommodated to the natural temper and bias of a people perfectly Egyptianized, and who knew nothing but the language, religion, laws, and customs of Egypt, and as this people could never be brought off from the religion and customs to which they had been naturalized, the history of Moses and the prophets gives one almost as just and adequate a notion of the religion, priesthood, and worship of Egypt, as if their own history had been handed down to us. Of this we need no other, or more authentic authority than our learned author's own concessions, who has granted as much in this respect as could have been desired. And though Moses attempted, in his law, to reform the religion of Egypt with regard to their symbolical polytheism or sidereal worship by images, yet this could never be effected. But the gross of the people still continued in the symbolical worship of Egypt, except when restrained from it by force and compulsion under some of their kings. But they immediately fell back again to the same sort of religion and worship as soon as that restriction and legal persecution were relaxed or taken off. Thus, I think it appears that the aperita in the greater mysteries were the detection of the origin of vulgar polytheism and the discovery of the doctrine of the unity. I will venture to go further and give the very history repeated and the very hymn sung on these occasions to the initiated, in the first of which was delivered the true origin and progress of vulgar polytheism, and in the other the unity of the deity. What hath been said will give light to a strange story told by Thucydides, Plutarch, and others of a debauch and night ramble of Alcibiades just before his expedition to Syracuse, in which, they say, he revealed to and acted over with his companions the mysteries of Ceres, that he assumed the office of the Hierophant, and called some of those he initiated Mystai and others Epoptai, and that, lastly, they broke all the statues of Hermes. These are mentioned as distinct actions, and unconnected with one another. Now we see their relation, and how one arose from the other, for Alcibiades, having revealed the origin of polytheism and the doctrine of the unity to his companions, nothing was more natural than for men, heated with wine, to run forth in a kind of religious fury, and break the statues of their idols. For what he acted over was the greater mysteries, as appears from Plutarch's calling them the mysteries of Ceres, and from Alcibiades calling some Apopti, the name of those who participated of the greater mysteries. Hath been said will give light to a strange story told by Thucydides, Plutarch, and others, of a debauch and night ramble of Alcibiades, just before his expedition to Syracuse, in which, they say, he revealed to and acted over with his companions the mysteries of Ceres, that he assumed the office of the Hierophant, and called some of those he initiated Mystai and others Epoptai, and that, lastly, they broke all the statues of Hermes. These are mentioned as distinct actions, and unconnected with one another. Now we see their relation, and how one arose from the other, for Alcibiades, having revealed the origin of polytheism and the doctrine of the unity to his companions, nothing was more natural than for men, heated with wine, to run forth in a kind of religious fury, and break the statues of their idols. For what he acted over was the greater mysteries, as appears from Plutarch's calling them the mysteries of Ceres, and from Alcibiades calling some Epoptai, the name of those who participated of the greater mysteries. For it appears to me that the celebrated fragment of Sanconiatho, the Phoenician translated by Philobiblius, and preserved by Eusebius, containing a genealogical account of the first ages, is that history, as it was wont to be read to the initiated, in the celebration of the Egyptian and Phoenician mysteries. the purpose of it being to inform us that their popular gods were only dead men deified. And as this curious and authentic record not only serves to illustrate the subject we are now upon, but will be of use to support what is said hereafter of the rise, progress, and order of the several species of ancient idolatry, it may not be improper to give a short extract of it in this place. He tells us then that of the two first mortals, Protagonus and Aeon, were begotten Ginos and Genia. These, in the time of great droughts, stretched their hands upwards to the sun, whom they regarded as a god and sole ruler of the heavens. From these, after 2 or 3 generations, came up Soranios and his brother Ausus. One of them invented the art of building cottages of reeds and rushes, the other the art of making garments of the skins of wild beasts. In their time, violent tempests of wind and rain having rubbed the large branches of the forest trees against one another, they took fire and burnt up the woods. Of the bare trunks of trees, they first made vessels to pass the waters. They consecrated 2 pillars to fire and wind, and then offered bloody sacrifices to them as to gods. And here let it be observed that this worship of the elements and heavenly bodies is truly represented as the first species of idolatry. After many generations came Cresort, and he likewise invented many things useful to civil life, for which, after his decease, he was worshipped as a god. Then flourished Eranos and his sister Gi, who deified and offered sacrifices to their father Opsistos when he had been torn in pieces by wild beasts. Afterwards, Kronos consecrated Moth his son, and was himself consecrated by his subjects, and this is as truly represented to be the second species of idolatry, the worship of dead men. He goes on and says that Eranos was the inventor of the Betilia, a kind of animated stones framed with great art, and that Taotus formed allegoric figures, characters, and images of the celestial gods and elements, in which is delivered the third species of idolatry, statue, and brute worship. For by the animated stones is meant stones cut into human shape, brute, unformed stones being before this invention consecrated and adored. As by Taotus's invention of allegoric figures is insinuated the origin of brute worship from the use of hieroglyphics. This is a very short and imperfect extract of the fragment. Many particulars, to avoid tediousness, are omitted, which would much support what we are upon, particularly a minute detail of the principal arts invented for the use of civil life. But what has been selected on this head will afford a good comment to a celebrated passage of Cicero, quoted in this section on another occasion. As the 2 important doctrines taught in secret were the detection of polytheism and the discovery of the unity, so the 2 capital doctrines taught more openly were the origin of society with the arts of life, and the existence of the soul after death in a state of reward or punishments. The fragment explains what Tully meant by men's being drawn by the mysteries from an irrational and savage life, and tamed, as it were, and broken to humanity. It was, we see, by the information given them concerning the origin of society and the inventors of the arts of life, and the rewards they received from grateful posterity for making themselves benefactors to mankind. The reasons which induce me to think this fragment the very history narrated to the Epopte in the celebration of the greater mysteries are these. First, it bears an exact conformity with what the ancients tell us that history contained in general, namely, an instruction that all the national gods, as well those majorum, such as Hypsistus, Eranos, and Kronos, as those minorum gentium, were only dead men deified, together with a recommendation of the advantages of civil life above the state of nature, and an excitement to the most considerable of the initiated to procure it. And these 2 ends are served together in the history of the rise and progress of idolatry as delivered in this fragment. Again, in order to recommend civil life and to excite men to promote its advantages, a lively picture is given of his miserable condition and how obnoxious he was in that state to the rage of all the elements, and how imperfectly, while he continued in it, he could, with all his industry, fence against them by food of acorns, by cottages of reeds, and by coats of skins, a matter the mysteries thought so necessary to be impressed, that we find, by Diodorus Siculus, there was a scenical representation of this state exhibited in their shows. His being hoodwinked is emblematic of the uninformed state of those not initiated into the mysteries, and the rope about his neck is in token of his submission to the divine will, as will hereafter be shown from the customs of the Druids. We here see the origin of the forlorn condition in which the candidate for Masonic honors is placed when prepared for initiation, who, neither naked nor clothed, barefoot nor shod, deprived of all metals, hoodwinked, with a cable tow about his neck, is led to the door of the lodge in a halting, moving posture. And what stronger excitement had heroic minds than to be taught, as they are in this fragment, that public benefits to their fellow creatures merit reward with immortality? My second reason for supposing it to be that very history is our being told that Synconiatho transcribed the account from secret records, kept in the penetralia of the temples, and written in a sacred sacerdotal character called the Ammonian, from the place where they were first deposited, which, as Marsham reasonably supposes, was Ammon, no, or Thebes in Egypt, a kind of writing employed by the hierophants of the mysteries. But lastly, we are told that when this genealogical history came into the hands of a certain son of Thebion, the first hierophant on record amongst the Phoenicians, he, after having corrupted it with allegories and intermixed physical and cosmical affections with historical, that is, made the one significative of the other, delivered it to the prophets of the orgies and the hierophants of the mysteries, who left it to their successors. So that now we have an express testimony for the fact here advanced, that this was the very history read to the Epoptai in the celebration of the greater mysteries. But one thing is too remarkable to pass by unobserved, and that is Sanconiatho's account of the corruption of this history with allegories and physical affections by one of his own countrymen, and of its delivery in that state to the Egyptians, for Osiris is the same as Osiris, who corrupted it still more. That the pagan mythology was indeed thus corrupted, I have shown at large in several parts of this work, but I believe not so early as is here pretended, which makes me suspect that Sanconiatho lived in a later age than his interpreter, Philo, assigns to him. And what confirms me in this suspicion is that mark of national vanity and partiality, common to aftertimes, in making the mysteries of his own country original and conveyed from Phoenicia to Egypt, whereas it is very certain they came first from Egypt. But of this elsewhere. However, let the reader take notice that the question concerning the antiquity of Sanconiatho does not at all affect our inference concerning the nature and use of this history. A criticism of that very knowing and sagacious writer, Father Simon of the Oratory, will show the reader how groundless the suspicions of learned men are concerning the genuineness of this fragment. Father Simon imagines that Porphyry forged the history of Sanconiatho under the name of a translation by Philobiblius, and conjectures his purpose in so doing was to support paganism, by taking from it its mythology and allegories, which the Christian writers perpetually objected to it. He would make it appear, to answer the objections that were made on all sides upon this, that their theology was a pure mythology. They go back to the times which had preceded the allegories and the fictions of the sacrificers. But this learned man totally mistakes the case. The Christians objected to vulgar paganism, that the stories told of their gods were immoral. To this, their priests and philosophers replied that these stories were only mythological allegories which veiled all the great truths of theology, ethics, and physics. The Christians said, this could not be, for that the stories of the gods had a substantial foundation, in fact, these gods being only dead men deified, who in life had like passions and infirmities with others, for the truth of which they appealed to such writers as Sanconiatho, who had given the history both of their mortal and immortal stations and conditions. How then could so acute an adversary as Porphyry, deeply engaged in this controversy, so far mistake the state of the question and grounds of his defense, as to forge a book in support of his cause, which totally overthrew it? The Reverend James Anderson, D.D., published in 1723 the first book on Masonry with the sanction of the Grand Lodge of England. The commencement of his work bears a strong resemblance to the foregoing fragment. Instead, however, of permitting the first inhabitants of the world to gain knowledge gradually by the aid of experience, he makes them finished artisans from the beginning. This was necessary for his purpose, which was to show the original establishment of the Freemason Society, as his account throws much light upon the early history of man and the amazing progress of the arts and sciences in the first stages of human existence, and is, moreover, greatly relied upon by Masons. As his account throws much light upon the early history of man and the amazing progress of the arts and sciences in the first stages of human existence, and is, moreover, greatly relied upon by Masons, I will here give a short abstract of it. The Almighty Architect, says the doctor, having created all things according to geometry, last of all formed Adam, and engraved on his heart the same noble science, which Adam soon discovered by survey. In his earthly paradise, and fabricating an arbor as a convenient shelter from heat, etc., when expelled from his lovely arbor, he resided in the most convenient abodes of the land of Eden, where he could be best secured from cold, heat, winds, rains, tempests, and wild beasts, till his sons grew up to form a lodge, whom he taught geometry and the great use of it in architecture, without which the children of men must have lived like brutes in woods, dens, caves, etc., or at best in poor huts of mud, or arbors made of branches of trees, etc. Tubal Cain wrought in metals, Jubal elevated music, and Jabal extended his tents. Adam was succeeded in the grand direction of the craft by Seth, Enoch, Cainan, Mahalaleel, and Jared, whose son Enoch was expert and bright, both in the science and in the art, and being a prophet, he foretold the destruction of the earth for sin, first by water, and afterwards by fire. Therefore Enoch erected 2 large pillars, the one of stone and the other of brick, whereon he engraved the abridgment of the arts and sciences, principally geometry and masonry. At last, when the world's destruction drew nigh, God commanded Noah to build the great ark or floating castle, and his 3 sons assisted, like a deputy and 2 wardens. That edifice, though of wood only, was fabricated by geometry as nicely as any stone building, like true shipbuilding at this day, a curious and large piece of architecture, and finished when Noah entered into his 600th year, aboard which he and his 3 sons and their 4 wives passed, and having received the cargo of animals by God at direction, they were saved in the ark, while the rest perished in the flood for their immorality and unbelief. And so, from these masons, or four grand officers, the whole present race of mankind are descended. After the flood, Noah and his 3 sons, having preserved the knowledge of the arts and sciences, communicated it to their growing offspring. And it came to pass, as they journeyed from the east toward the west, they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and dwelt there together, as Noachida, or sons of Noah, which was the first name of masons, according to some old traditions. When Peleg was born then to Heber, after the flood 101 years, Father Noah partitioned the earth, ordering them to disperse and take possession. But from a fear of the consequences of separation, they resolved to keep together. Nimrod, the son of Cush, the eldest son of Ham, was at the head of those that would not disperse, or if they must separate. They resolved to transmit their memorial illustrious to all future ages, and so employed themselves under Grand Master Nimrod, in the large and fertile vale of Shinar, along the banks of the Tigris, in building a stately tower and city, the largest work that ever the world saw, and soon filled the vale with splendid edifices. Nimrod signifies rebel, the name that the Israelites gave him, but his friends called him Baalus, Lord. But they overbuilt it, and knew not when to desist till their vanity provoked their maker to confound their grand design by confounding their speech. Hence the city was called Babel, confusion. Thus they were forced to disperse, about 53 years after they began to build, or after the flood, 150 to 4 years, when the general migration from Shinar commenced. They went off at various times, and traveled north, south, east, and west with their mighty skill, and found the good use of it in settling their colonies. But Nimrod went forth no farther than into the land of Assyria, and founded the first great empire at his capital Nineveh, where he long reigned. Under him flourished many learned mathematicians, whose successors were long afterwards called Chaldees and Magians, and though many of them turned image worshippers, yet even that idolatry occasioned an improvement in the arts of designing, for Ninus, king of Nineveh, or Assyria, ordered his best artist to frame the statue of Baal that was worshipped in a gorgeous temple. This history of Dr. Anderson is the only authority that Masonry can produce to substantiate the extraordinary antiquity which it claims. The specimen I have given of it is sufficient for the reader to form an opinion of its authenticity, as well as its resemblance to the fragment of Sanchoniatho. Nimrod, Bel, Baal, and Belus are supposed by mythologists to be the same person. We will turn to Warburton. We now come to the hymn celebrating the unity of the Godhead, which was sung in the Eleusinian Mysteries by the Hierophant, habited like the Creator. A passage in Porphyry shows what kind of personage the Creator was represented by, and that it was, like all the rest, of Egyptian, original, and introduced into these secret mysteries for the reason above explained. And this I take to be the little Orphic poem quoted by Clemens Alexandrinus and Eusebius, which begins thus: I will declare a secret to the initiated, but let the doors be shut against the profane. But thou, O Musaeus, the offspring of bright Selene, attend carefully to my song, for I shall deliver the truth without disguise. Suffer not, therefore, thy former prejudices to debar thee of that happy life which the knowledge of these sublime truths will procure unto thee, but carefully contemplate this divine oracle, and preserve it in purity of mind and heart. Go on, in the right way, and see the sole governor of the world. He is one, and of himself alone, and to that one all things owe their being. That is, his representative. But how he could be habited like the Creator, who is never seen by mortal eyes, it is difficult to imagine. He operates through all, was never seen by mortal eyes, but does himself see every one. The reasons which support my conjecture are these. 1. We learn from the Scholiast on Aristophanes and others that hymns were sung in the mysteries. 2. Orpheus, as we have said, first brought the mysteries from Egypt into Thrace and even religion itself, hence it was called Thracia, as being supposed the invention of the Thracian. 3. The verses, which go under the name of Orpheus, are at least more ancient than Plato and Herodotus, though since interpolated. It was the common opinion that they were genuine, and those who doubted of that yet gave them to the earliest Pythagoreans. 4. The subject of them are the mysteries, under the several titles of Thronismoi Metronoi, Teletai, Hieros, Logos, and Tisado Catabasis. 5. Pausanias tells us that Orpheus's hymns were sung in the rites of Ceres, in preference to Homer's, though more elegant, for the reasons given above. 6. This hymn is addressed to Musaeus, his disciple, who was said, though falsely, to institute the mysteries at Athens, as his master had done in Thrace, and begins with the formula used by the mystagogue, on that occasion warning the profane to keep a distance, and in the 4th line mentions that new life or regeneration to which the initiated were taught to aspire. 7. No other original than the singing the hymns of Orpheus in the Eleusinian Mysteries can be well imagined of that popular opinion mentioned by Theodore, that Orpheus instituted those mysteries when the Athenians had such certain records of another founder. 8. We are told that one article of the Athenians' charge against Diagoras for revealing the mysteries was his making the Orphic speech, or hymn, the subject of his common conversation. 9. But lastly, the account which Clemens gives of this hymn seems to put the matter out of question. His words are these: "But the Thracian mystagogue, who was at the same time a poet, Orpheus, the son of Uiger, after he had opened the mysteries and sung the whole theology of idols, recants all he had said and introduceth truth. The sacreds then truly begin, though late, and thus he enters upon to understand the force of this passage, we are to know that the mystagogue explained the representations in the mysteries, where, as we learn from Apuleius, the supernal and infernal gods passed in review. To each of these they sung a hymn, which Clemens calls the theology of images, or idols. These are yet to be seen amongst the works ascribed to Orpheus. When all this was over, then came the Aperita, delivered in the hymn in question, and, after that, the assembly was dismissed, with these two barbarous words, cog ex omphax, which shows the mysteries not to have been originally Greek. The learned Mr. Leclerc well observes that this seems to be only an ill pronunciation of cots and omphets which, he tells us, signify in the Phoenician tongue, watch and abstain from evil. In closing a Royal Arch chapter, the high priest says, "May we invariably practice all those duties out of the chapter, which are inculcated in it." Response: so mote it be, amen. Thus the reader sees the end, and use both of the greater and less mysteries, and that, as well in what they hid as what they divulged, all aimed at the benefit of the state. To this end, they were to draw in as many as they could to their general participation, which they did by spreading abroad the doctrine of a providence, and a future state, and how much happier the initiated would be, and what superior felicities they were entitled to in another life. It was on this account that antiquity is so full and express in this part. But then they were to make those they had got in as virtuous as they could, which they provided for by discovering, to such as were capable of the secret, the whole delusion of polytheism. Now this being supposed, the shaking foundations was to be done with all possible circumspection, and under the most tremendous seal of secrecy. For they taught, the gods themselves punished the revealers of the secret, and not them only, but the hearers of it too. Nor did they altogether trust to that neither, for more effectually to curb an ungovernable curiosity, the state decreed capital punishments against the betrayers of the mysteries, and inflicted them with merciless severity. The case of Diagoras, the Melian, is too remarkable to be omitted. This man had revealed the Orphic and Eleusinian mysteries, and so passed with the people for an atheist, which at once confirms what hath been said of the object of the secret doctrines, and of the mischief that would attend the indiscreet communication of them. He likewise dissuaded his friends from being initiated into these rites, the consequence of which was that the city of Athens prescribed him and set a price upon his head. While Socrates, who preached up the latter part of this doctrine, and Epicurus, who taught the former, were suffered, because they delivered their opinions only as points of philosophic speculation amongst their followers to live a long time unmolested. And this, perhaps, was the reason why Socrates declined being initiated, which, as it appeared a singular affectation, exposed him to much censure, but it was forborne with his usual prudence. He remembered that Aeschylus, on a mere imagination of his having given a hint in his scenes of something in the mysteries, had like to have been torn in pieces on the stage by the people, and only escaped by an appeal to the Areopagus, which venerable court acquitted him of that dangerous imputation on his proving that he had never been initiated. The famous Euhemerus, who assumed the same office of Hierophant to the people at large, with more boldness than Socrates and more temperance than Epicurus, employed another expedient to screen himself from the laws, though he fell, and perhaps deservedly, under the same imputation of atheism. Some enlightened persons did not believe that to be virtuous there was any necessity for such an association. Diogenes was once advised to contract this sacred engagement, but he answered, Patasion, the notorious robber, obtained initiation. Epaminondas and Agesilas never solicited it. Is it possible, I should believe, that the former will enjoy the bliss of the Elysian fields, while the latter shall be dragged through the mire of the infernal shades? He gave a fabulous relation of a voyage to the imaginary island of Panchaea, a kind of ancient utopia, where, in a temple of Jupiter, he found a genealogical record, which discovered to him the births and deaths of the greater gods, and, in short, everything that the Hierophant revealed to the initiated on this subject. Thus, he too avoided the suspicion of a betrayer of the mysteries. This, therefore, is the reason why so little is to be met with concerning the Apereta. Varro and Cicero, the two most inquisitive persons in antiquity, affording but a glimmering light. The first giving us a short account of the cause only of the secret, without mentioning the doctrine, and the other, a hint of the doctrine, without mentioning the cause. But now, a remarkable exception to all we have been saying concerning the secrecy of the mysteries obtrudes itself upon us in the case of the Oretians, who, as Diodorus Siculus assures us, celebrated their mysteries openly and taught their Aperita without reserve. His words are these: At Knossos in Crete, it was provided for by an ancient law that these mysteries should be shown openly to all, and that those things which in other places were delivered in secret should be hid from none who were desirous of knowing them. as contrary as this seems to the principles delivered above, it will be found, on attentive reflection, altogether to confirm them. We have shown that the great secret was the detection of polytheism, which was done by teaching the original of the gods, their birth from mortals, and their advancement to divine honor for benefits done to their country or mankind. But it is to be observed that the Cretans proclaimed this to all the world by showing and boasting of the tomb of Jupiter himself, the father of gods and men. How, then, could they tell that as a secret in their mysteries, which they told to everyone out of them? Nor is it less remarkable that the Cretans themselves, as Diodorus, in the same place, tells us, gave this very circumstance of their celebrating the mysteries openly as a proof of their being. The first who had consecrated dead mortals. These are the old stories which the Cretans tell of their gods who, they pretend to say, were born amongst them, and they urge this as an invincible reason to prove that the adoration, the worship, and the mysteries of these gods were first derived from Crete to the rest of the world. For, whereas, amongst the Athenians, those most illustrious mysteries of all, called the Eleusinian, those of Samothrace, and those of the Ciconians in Thrace, of Orpheus's institution, are all celebrated in secret, yet in Crete and so on, as above. For it seems the Cretans were proud of their invention, and used this method to proclaim and perpetuate the notice of it. So when Pythagoras, as Porphyry informs us, had been initiated into the Cretan mysteries, and had continued in the Idaean cave 3 times, 9 days, he wrote this epigram on the tomb of Jupiter. Zan, whom men call Jupiter, lies here deceased. It was this which so much exasperated the other Grecians against them, and gave birth to the common proverb of Kretis e sustai, the Cretans are eternal liars. For nothing could more affront these superstitious idolaters than asserting the fact, or more displease the politic protectors of the mysteries than the divulging it. The mysteries then being of so great service to the state, we shall not be surprised to hear the wisest of the ancients speaking highly in their commendation, and their best lawgivers and reformers providing carefully for their support. Ceres hath made the Athenians 2 presents of the greatest consequence: corn, which brought us out of a state of brutality, and the mysteries, which teach the initiated to entertain the most agreeable expectations touching death and eternity. And Plato introduces Socrates speaking after this manner. In my opinion, those who established the mysteries, whoever they were well skilled in human nature. For in these rites it was of old signified to the aspirant, that those who died without being initiated stuck fast in mire and filth, but that he who was purified and initiated at his death should have his habitation with the gods. And Tully thought them of such use to society, for preserving and propagating the doctrine of a future state of rewards and punishments, that in the law, where he forbids nocturnal sacrifices offered by women, he makes an express exception for the mysteries of Ceres, as well as for the sacrifices to the good goddess. Aristides said, the welfare of Greece was secured by the Eleusinian mysteries alone. Indeed, the Greeks seemed to place their chief happiness in them. So Euripides makes Hercules say, I was blessed when I got a sight of the mysteries, and it was a proverbial speech, when anyone thought himself in the highest degree happy, to say, I seem as if I had been initiated in the higher mysteries. But now, such is the fate of human things, these mysteries, venerable as they were, in their first institution did, it must be owned, in course of time, degenerate, and those very provisions made by the state, to enable the mysteries to obtain the end of their establishment, became the very means of defeating it. For we can assign no surer cause of the horrid abuses and corruptions of the mysteries than the season in which they were represented, and the profound silence in which they were buried. For night gave opportunity to wicked men to attempt evil actions, and secrecy, encouragement to repeat them, and the inviolable nature of that secrecy which encouraged abuses, kept them from the magistrate's knowledge so long till it was too late to reform them. In a word, we must own that these mysteries, so powerful in their first institution for the promotion of virtue and knowledge, became in time horribly subservient to the gratification of lust and revenge. Nor will this appear at all strange after what hath been said above. A like corruption, from the same cause, crept even into the church during the purest ages of it. The primitive Christians, in imitation perhaps of these pagan rites, or from the same kind of spirit, had a custom of celebrating vigils in the night, which at first were performed with all becoming sanctity, but in a little time they were so overrun with abuses that it was necessary to abolish them. And the same remedy, Cicero tells us, Digondas the Theban was forced to apply to the disorders of the mysteries. However, this was not the only, though the most powerful cause of the deprivation of the mysteries. Another, doubtless, was their being sometimes under the patronage of those deities, who were supposed to inspire and preside over sensual passions, such as Bacchus, Venus, and Cupid, for these had all their mysteries, and where was the wonder if the initiated should be sometimes inclined to give a loose to vices in which the patron god was supposed to delight? And in this case, the hidden doctrine came too late to put a stop to the disorder. However, it is remarkable, and confirms what hath been said concerning the origin of the mysteries, and of their being invented to perpetuate the doctrine of a future state, that the doctrine continued to be taught even in the most debauched celebrations of the mysteries of Cupid and Bacchus. Nay, even that very flagitious part of the mysterious rites, when at worst, the carrying the Ketais and Phallos in procession, was introduced but under pretense of there being emblems of the mystical regeneration and new life into which the initiated had engaged themselves to enter. The last cause to which one may ascribe their corruption was the hierophants withdrawing the mysteries from the care and inspection of the civil magistrate, whose original institution they were. But in after times it would happen that a little priest, who had borne an inferior share in these rites, would leave his society and country, and set up for himself, and in a clandestine manner, without the allowance or knowledge of the magistrate, institute and celebrate the mysteries in private conventicles. From rites so managed, it is easy to believe many enormities would arise. This was the original of those horrid impieties committed in the mysteries of Bacchus at Rome, of which the historian Livy has given so circumstantial an account. For in the beginning of his story he tells us, the mischief was occasioned by one of these priests bringing the mysteries into Etruria on his own head, uncommissioned by his superiors in Greece from whom he learnt them, and unauthorized by the state into which he had introduced them. The words of Livy show that the mysteries were, in their own nature, a very different affair, and invented for the improvement of knowledge and virtue. A Greek of mean extraction, a little priest and soothsayer, came first into Etruria without any skill or wisdom in mysterious rites, many sorts of which, that most improved people have brought in amongst us, for the culture and perfection both of mind and body. What Livy means by the culture of the body will be seen hereafter when we come to speak of the probationary and toilsome trials undergone by those aspirants to the mysteries, called the soldiers of Mithras. However, it is very true that in Greece itself the mysteries became abominably abused, a proof of which we have even in the conduct of their comic writers, who frequently lay the scene of their subject, such as the rape of a young girl, and the like, at the celebration of a religious mystery, and from that mystery denominate the comedy. And in the time of Cicero, the terms mysteries and abominations were almost synonymous. The academic, having said they had secrets and mysteries, Lucullus replies, Quae sunt tandem ista mysteria, aut cursalatis, quasi terp aliquid, vestrum sententiam? What, after all, are these mysteries? Or why conceal your purpose as if it included something base? However, in spite of all occasions and opportunities, some of the mysteries, as particularly the Eleusinian, continued for many ages, pure and undefiled. The two capital corruptions of the mysteries were magic and impurities. Yet, so late as the age of Apollonius Tian, the Eleusinian kept so clear of the first imputation that the Hierophant refused to initiate that impostor because he was a magician. And, indeed, their long-continued immunity, both from one and the other corruption, will not appear extraordinary if we consider that, by a law of Solon, the Senate was always to meet the day after the celebration of these mysteries to see that nothing had been done amiss during the performance, so that these were the very last that submitted to the common fate of all human institutions. And here the fathers will hardly escape the censure of those who will not allow high provocation to be an excuse for an unfair representation of an adversary. They will hardly escape censure for accustoming themselves to speak of the mysteries as gross impieties and immoralities. In their very original dot, what hath been said above shows that M. Leclerc hath gone into the other extreme when he contends that the mysteries were not corrupted at all. I can conceive no reason for his paradox, but as it favored an accusation against the fathers, who have much insisted on the corruption of them. The fathers have said that all kinds of lewdness were committed in the mysteries, but whatever they may say, it is not credible that all Greece, however corrupt it may have been, has ever consented that the women and girls should prostitute themselves in the mysteries. But some Christian authors have found no difficulty in saying 1,000 things little conformable to truth, to defame paganism, as though there were none but pagans against whom they could discharge their calumnies. Bibel, Univ, Tom, Vi, p. 120. Clemens Alexandrinus, in a heat of zeal, breaks out, Let him be accursed, who first infected the world with these impostures, whether it was Dardanus or etc. These I make no scruple to call wicked authors of impious fables, the fathers of an execrable superstition, who, by this institution, sowed in human life the seeds of vice and corruption. But the wisest and best of the pagan world invariably hold that the mysteries were instituted pure and proposed the noblest end by the worthiest means. The truth of the matter was this. The fathers bore a secret grudge to the mysteries for their injurious treatment of Christianity on its first appearance in the world. We are to observe that atheism, by which was meant a contempt of the gods, was reckoned, in the mysteries, amongst the greatest crimes. So, in the 6th book of the Aeneid, the hottest. Seats in Tartarus are allotted to the atheist, such as Salmanius, Titius, and the Titans, etc. Now the Christians, for their contempt of the national gods, were, on their first appearance, deemed atheists by the people, and so branded by the mystagogue, as we find in Lucian, and exposed amongst the rest in Tartarus in their solemn shows and representations. This may be gathered from a remarkable passage in Origen, where Celsus thus addresses his adversary. But now, as you, good man, believe eternal punishments. Even so do the interpreters of these holy mysteries, the mystagogues and initiators. You threaten others with them. These, on the contrary, threaten you. This, without doubt, was what sharpened the fathers against the mysteries, and they were not always tender in loading what they did not approve. But here comes in the strange part of the story, that after this, they should so studiously and formally transfer the terms, phrases, rites, ceremonies, and discipline of these odious mysteries into our holy religion, and thereby very early vitiate and deprave what a pagan writer could see and acknowledge to be absolute and simple as it came out of the hands of its author. Sure, then, it was some more than ordinary veneration the people had for these mysteries that could incline the fathers of the church to so fatal a counsel. However, the thing is notorious, and the effects have been severely felt. The reader will not be displeased to find here an exact account of this whole matter, extracted from a very curious dissertation of a great and unexceptionable writer, is Casaubon, in his 16th excerpt, on the Annals of Baronius, when the fathers found it to be an easier way of bringing over minds corrupted by superstition to the love of the truth. They first adopted many terms used in their rites, and after thus treating of several heads of the true doctrines, they further adopted some of their ceremonies, that they might seem to be saying, as Paul said to the Gentiles, whom ye ignorantly worship, the same do I declare unto you. Thence it came that the fathers called the sacraments by the same names as were used to describe the mysteries, as musis, teletos, teleosi, epoptias, or epopsias, telesteria, and sometimes, but more rarely, orgies. The Eucharist they emphatically denominated the mystery of mysteries, and also, by antonymy, the mystery, or in the plural, the mysteries. And you may everywhere read in the writings of the fathers, when treating of the Holy Communion, the words frieta mysteria, or aperiton mysterion, referring to those that were to be divulged and those that were not. So the Greek verb maestai, in the ancient writing, is often employed to signify the becoming a partaker of the Lord's Supper, and the term maisin for the act itself, and mystis for the priest, who is also called mystagogon and hierotelastes. In the Greek liturgies and elsewhere hierotelit, and kryptiai epiphobos telet means the Eucharist, and as certain degrees were used in the pagan rites, so in like manner Dionysius divides the whole tradition of the sacraments into 3 acts, distinguished by their seasons and ceremonies. The first was catharsis, the purgation or purification, the second the mystis or initiation, and the third teleosis or the consummation, which they also frequently called epopsian or the revered. Tully had before affirmed that the Athenian mysteries brought to the dying better hopes. On their part, the fathers maintained that the mysteries of Christ brought certain salvation and eternal life to those who worthily partook of them, and that for those who contemned them there was no salvation. And they did not scruple to say that the end and ultimate fruit of the sacraments was deification, when they knew that the authors of those vain superstitions had dared to promise the same honor to their initiates. And therefore you may read in the Fathers that the end of the holy mystagogies was deification, and that those who faithfully receive them should in the life to come be gods. Athanasius has used the verb theopoestai in the same sense, and subsequently confirmed it by saying that by partaking of the Spirit we are united to the Godhead. Of the symbols of the sacraments, by which those ceremonies are celebrated, it is not here the place to treat, but that which is called a symbol of faith is various in its kinds, and they serve as tokens or tests by which the faithful may recognize each other. And we show that the same were used in the pagan mysteries. The formula pronounced by the deacons, "Depart hence, all ye catechumens, all ye possessed and uninitiated," corresponds with the procul est profani of the pagans. Many rites of the pagans were performed in the night, and Guadentius has the expression splendidissima nox vigiliarum, the brightest night of the vigils. And as to what we have said of the silence observed by the pagans in their secret devotions, the ancient Christians so far approved that they exceeded all their mysteries in that observance. And as Seneca has observed, the most holy of the sacred rites were only known to the initiated, and Iamblichus on the philosophy of the Pythagoreans has distinguished between the apparata, which could not be carried abroad, and the exphora, which might. So the ancient Christians distinguished their whole doctrines into those which might be divulged to all, and the apparata, or arcana, which were not rashly to be disclosed. Their dogmas, says Basilius, they kept secret, their preaching was public. And Chrysostom, treating of those who were baptized for the dead, says, I verily desire to relate the matter fully, but I dare not be particular, because of the uninitiated. They make a difficulty for us in the interpretation, and oblige us either to speak without precision, or else to disclose what they should not be informed of. And as the pagans use the terms exorcistai to mysteria, touching those who divulge the mysteries, so Dionysius says, see that you do not disclose, nor slightly reverence the mysteries. And everywhere in Augustinus you will read of the sacrament known to the faithful, and thus all the catechumens already believe in Christ, but Christ does not trust them. And if we should ask one of them whether he eat the flesh of the Son of Man, he would not understand what we meant. And again, the catechumens are ignorant of what the Christians receive. Let them blush that they are ignorant. We have observed above that the fathers gave very easy credit to what was reported of the abominations in the mysteries, and the easier, perhaps, on account of the secrecy with which they were celebrated. The same affectation of secrecy in the Christian rites, and the same language in speaking of them, without doubt procured as easy credit to those calumnies of murder and incest charged upon them by the pagans. Nay, what is still more remarkable, those very specific enormities in which their own mysteries were then known to offend, they objected to in the Christians. A catechumen is a candidate for baptism, or a person who prepares himself for receiving it. Towards the end of the 1st century, Christians were divided into 2 orders, distinguished by the names of believers and catechumens. The latter, as contrasted from the former, were such as had not yet been dedicated to God and Christ by baptism, and were, therefore, admitted neither to the public prayers, nor to the Holy Communion, nor to the ecclesiastical assemblies. As they were not allowed to assist at the celebration of the Eucharist, the deacon dismissed them, after sermon, with this formula, proclaimed 3 times, Aite catechumeni missa est. Missa is derived from mitto, to send. Missa has been used for missio. Ite missa est, or missio est. You may all return home, quod norunt fideles, what the faithful know. These words, or, as expressed in Greek, idani oi pepismoi, form what may be called the watchword of the secret, and occur constantly in the Fathers. Thus St. Chrysostom, for instance, in whose writings Casaubon remarked the recurrence of this phrase at least 50 times, in speaking of the tongue, says, Reflect that this is the member with which we receive the tremendous sacrifice. The faithful know what I speak of. Hardly less frequent is the occurrence of the same phrase in St. Augustine, who seldom ventures to intimate the Eucharist in any other way than by the words quod norunt fideles. This precaution needs no apology when referring to religious rites, which, if exposed, would subject its votaries to punishment. It was, says the same writer, in the 3rd century, when the followers of Christ were most severely tried by the fires of persecution, that the discipline of secrecy, with respect to this and the other mysteries, was most strictly observed. A faithful concealment is due to all mysteries from the very nature and constitution of them. How much more must it be due to such mysteries as, if they were once discovered, could not escape immediate punishment from the hands of man? The persecuted, when they obtained the majority, became the persecutors, and the Druids of England were under the same necessity of concealing their dogmas and rites as the Christians formerly had been. But what excuse have the Masons of the present day for making a mystery of the same rites when not in danger of persecution? There can be no pretext for retaining a secret when the cause that gave it birth no longer exists. Besides, the Masons do not profess the doctrines of paganism. They merely repeat the ceremonies, parrot-like, without any regard to or knowledge of the original intention. That the mysteries were invented, established, and supported by lawgivers may be seen, from the place of their original, which was Egypt. This Herodotus, Diodorus, and Plutarch, who collect from ancient testimonies, expressly affirm, and this all antiquity concurs, the Eleusinian mysteries particularly retaining the very Egyptian gods in whose honor they were celebrated, Ceres and Triptolemus being only 2 other names for Isis and Osiris. Mr. Leclerc owns that Plutarch, Diodorus, and Theodoret have all said this. Yet, the better to support his scheme in the interpretation of the history of Ceres, he has thought fit to contradict them. Yet he in another place could see that Astarte was certainly Isis, as Adonis was Osiris, and this merely from the identity of their ceremonies. Hence it is that the universal nature, or the first cause, the object of all the mysteries, yet disguised under diverse names, speaking of herself in Apuleius, concludes the enumeration of her various mystic rites in these words, The Egyptians skilled in ancient learning, worshipping me by ceremonies perfectly appropriate, call me by my true name, Queen Isis. But the similitude between the rites practiced and the doctrines taught in the Grecian and Egyptian mysteries would be alone sufficient to point up to their original, such as the secrecy required of the initiated, which, as we shall see hereafter, peculiarly characterized the Egyptian teaching, such as the doctrines taught of a metempsychosis, and a future state of rewards and punishments, which the Greek writers agree to have been first set abroach by the Egyptians, such as abstinence enjoined from domestic fowl, fish, and beans, the peculiar superstition of the Egyptians, such as the ritual composed in hieroglyphics, an invention of the Egyptians. Timaeus the Locrian, in his book of the Soul of the World, speaking of the necessity of inculcating the doctrine of future punishments, calls them Timopiae Xenai, foreign torments, by which name both Latin and Greek writers generally mean Egyptian, where the subject is religion. But it would be endless to reckon up all the particulars in which the Egyptian and Grecian mysteries agree. It shall suffice to say that they were in all things the same. Again, nothing but the supposition of this common original to all the Grecian mysteries can clear up and reconcile the disputes which arose amongst the Grecian states and cities concerning the first rise of the mysteries, every one claiming to be original to the rest. Thus Thrace pretended that they came first from thence, Crete contested the honor with those barbarians, and Athens claimed it from both. And at that time, when they had forgotten the true original, it was impossible to settle and adjust their differences, for each could prove that he did not borrow from others, and at the same time, seeing a similitude in the rites, would conclude that they had borrowed from him. But the owning Egypt for their common parent clears up all difficulties by accounting for that general likeness which gave birth to everyone's pretensions. Now, in Egypt, all religious worship being planned and established by statesmen and directed to the ends of policy, we must conclude that the mysteries were originally invented by legislators. The sages who brought them out of Egypt and propagated them in Asia, in Greece, and Britain were all kings or lawgivers, such as Zoroaster, Inachus, Orpheus, Melampus, Trophonius, Minos, Cinyras, Erechtheus, and the Druids. And so says Diodorus Siculus, lib. I. Bible. They were under the superintendence of the state. A magistrate, entitled Basilius, or king, presided in the Eleusinian mysteries. Lysias informs us that this king was to offer up the public prayers according to their country rites, and to see that nothing impious or immoral crept into the celebration. This title given to the president of mysteries was, doubtless, in memory of the first founder, though it be now apparent that the mysteries were the invention of the civil magistrate, yet even some ancients who have mentioned the mysteries seemed not to be apprised of it, and their ignorance hath occasioned great embroilment in all they say on this subject. The reader may see, by the second chapter of Mircus's Eleusinia, how much the ancients were at a loss for the true founder of those mysteries, some giving the institution to Ceres, some to Triptolemus, others to Eumolpus, others to Musaeus, and some, again, to Erechtheus. How then shall we disengage ourselves from this labyrinth, into which Mircus has led us, and in which his guard of ancients keep us enclosed? This clue will easily conduct us through it. It appears, from what hath been said, that Erechtheus, king of Athens, established the mysteries, but that the people unluckily confounded the institutor with the priests Eumolpus and Musaeus, who first officiated in the rites, and with Ceres and Triptolemus, the deities, in whose honor they were celebrated. And these mistakes were natural enough. The poets would be apt, in the license of their figurative style, to call the gods, in whose name the mysteries were performed, the founders of those mysteries, and the people, seeing only the ministry of the officiating priests, in good earnest believed those mystagogues to be the founders. Shol, hom, il. It was the same in the Kabiric mysteries, as we learn from Diodorus Siculus, lib. V, who speaks of the like innovation made there. As to slaves, hear Aristophanes in his Thesmophorias. Begone, ye vulgar crew, it is not fitting that slaves should hear these words. And yet, if it were reasonable to expect from poets or people attention to their own fancies and opinions, one would think they might have distinguished better, by the help of that mark, which Erechtheus left behind him to ascertain his title, namely, the erection of the officer called Basileus, or king. But this original is still further seen from the qualities required in the aspirants to the mysteries. According to their original institution, neither slaves nor foreigners were to be admitted into them. Shol, hom, il. It was the same in the Kabiric mysteries, as we learn from Diodorus Siculus, lib. V, who speaks of the like innovation made there. As to slaves, hear Aristophanes in his Thesmophorias. Begone, ye vulgar crew, it is not fitting that slaves should hear these words. Now if, of whom Aristophanes says, Orpheus taught us the mysteries, and to abstain from murder, that is, from a life of rapine and violence, such as men lived in the state of nature. The mysteries were instituted, primarily for the sake of teaching religious truths. There can be no reason given why every man, with the proper moral qualities, should not be admitted, but supposing them instituted by the state for political purposes, a very good one may be assigned, for slaves and foreigners have there neither property nor country. When afterwards the Greeks, by frequent confederations against the Persian, the common enemy of their liberties, began to consider themselves as one, people and community, the mysteries were extended to all who spoke the Greek language. Yet the ancients, not reflecting on the original and end of their institution, were much perplexed for the reasons of an exclusion so apparently capricious. Lucian tells us, in the life of his friend Demonax, that great philosopher had the courage, one day, to ask the Athenians why they excluded barbarians from their mysteries, when Eumolpus, a barbarous Thracian, had established them, but he does not tell us their answer. But the fact, their not being a Grecian but a foreign, that is, barbarous, invention, is proved by their very name, Mysteria, from the Eastern dialect, Mistor or Mister, res aut locus absconditus. One of the most judicious of the modern critics was as much at a loss, and therefore thinks the restraint ridiculous, as implying that the institutors thought the speaking the Greek tongue contributed to the advancement of piety. Another proof of this original may be deduced from what was taught promiscuously to all the initiated, which was the necessity of a virtuous and holy life to obtain a happy immortality. Now this, we know, could not come from the sacerdotal warehouse. The priests could afford their elysium at the easy expense of oblations and sacrifices, for, As our great philosopher well observes, the priests made it not their business to teach the people virtue. If they were diligent in their observances and ceremonies, punctual in their feasts and solemnities, and the tricks of religion, the holy tribe assured them that the gods were pleased, and they looked no further. Few went to the schools of philosophers to be instructed in their duty and to know what was good and evil in their actions. The priests sold the better pennyworths, and therefore had all the custom for lustrations, and sacrifices were much easier than a clean conscience and a steady course of virtue, and an expiatory sacrifice that atoned for the want of it much more convenient than a strict and holy life. Now we may be assured that an institution which taught the necessity of strict and holy life could not but be the invention of lawgivers, to whose schemes virtue was so necessary. It is now submitted to the reader, whether it be not fairly proved, that the mysteries were invented by the legislator to affirm and establish the general doctrine of a providence by inculcating the belief of a future state of rewards and punishments. Indeed, if we may believe a certain ancient, who appears to have been well versed in these matters, they gained their end by clearing up all doubts concerning the righteous government of the gods. Sopater in de divisionibus questionum. It seems of very little importance to determine whether the mysteries were the invention of civil legislators or of the sacerdotal order. And in fact, in Egypt, where they were first established, the priesthood and the legislators formed but one body. This was also the case in Britain, where the Druids performed the offices of priests and were at the same time the makers of the laws. Tytler, in his Elements of General History in the chapter on Egypt, says, "The functions of the sovereign were partly civil and partly religious. The king had the chief regulation of all that regarded the gods, and the priests, considered as his deputies, filled all the offices of state. They were both the legislators and the civil judges. They imposed and levied the taxes, and regulated weights and measures." The title Basileus, given to one of the officers in the celebrations of the mysteries, who is decorated with a crown, has doubtless caused the supposition that this character was the representative of civil temporal power. Whereas the crown was originally the ensign of divinity, in the remotest antiquity the crown was only given to gods. Leo, the Egyptian, says it was Isis who first wore a crown, and that it consisted of ears of corn, the use whereof she first taught men. In this most authors agree, that the crown originally was rather a religious than a civil ornament, rather one of the pontificals than the regalia, that it only became common to kings, as the ancient kings were priests as well as princes, and that the modern princes are entitled to it in their ecclesiastical capacity rather than their temporal. The author cites no authority for his assertion that a magistrate entitled Basilius or king presided in the Eleusinian mysteries. But, he says, Lessius informs us that this king was to offer up the public prayers according to their country rites, and to see that nothing impious or immoral crept into the celebration. Lessius, it appears, was noticed by Cicero as an orator of some repute, but he is little known as an author, and he seems in this case to have indulged his fancy in one of his popular orations, without possessing an absolute knowledge of the truth of his declaration, for there is no evidence of his having been initiated into the mysteries. He was no doubt deceived by the title given to one of the officers in these celebrations, which is very likely to be generally known. Besides, the bishop has shown above that, by a law of Solon, the Senate was always to meet the day after the celebration of these mysteries, to see that nothing had been done amiss during the performance. Now, if there were a magistrate appointed by the king, bearing his title, and presiding in these celebrations as his representative, what need would there be for the meeting of the Senate for the purpose here stated? Jamblichus, who, by the by, was a pagan priest, and appears to be thoroughly versed in the metaphysical science of the gods, has clearly intimated who this Basilius of the mysteries was. In speaking of the One Supreme, he says, prior to truly existing beings and total principles, there is one God, prior to the first God and King, immovable and abiding in the solitude of his own unity, who is Father of himself, is self-begotten, is Father alone, and is truly good. The original of that part of the passage particularly alluded to is proton kaiton, proton theon kai Basileus, which Gale properly translates, prior etiam primo Deo et rege, that is, prior to the first God and King, the Son. For it is well known that the Son was the first object of adoration among all the ancient nations, and he was styled the king or governor of the world. The supreme God alluded to by Jamblichus was called in Egypt Kineph, of whom Plutarch says the unbegotten. Kineph was celebrated with an extraordinary degree of veneration by the Egyptian Thebans. As a further proof of the erroneous opinion formed by our author on this subject, an appeal may be made to the practice of royal arch masonry, which I deem conclusive in this and similar cases. Here, the hierophant or high priest is the presiding officer, and the king holds the second rank, and presides only in the absence of the former. And the idea that this officer was ever the representative of an earthly monarch was never entertained by Masons. No civil power has ever exercised any authority in the lodge, and although some of the royal family of England and also other countries have become members of the fraternity, they enter it like other men, on the ground of perfect equality. In short, the officer-styled king personates Osiris the sun, one of the divinities celebrated in the mysteries, the second person in the pagan trinity. It is worthy of remark, and perhaps here is the most proper place to make it, that Masonry conforms to the practice of the Egyptians in prohibiting to slaves a participation of its mystic rites. It excludes also all those who possess any bodily defect. That a benevolent society, as the Masonic institution is, should make a misfortune of this kind the cause of debarring admission to its social and friendly communion, admits of no justification. No Mason can give a plausible reason for it. It is an outrage against humanity. Anyone who, in fighting the battles of liberty in his country, should have lost a leg or an arm in the conflict would in vain apply for admission into this society. Every Mason has sworn not to be present at the initiation of a person thus situated. He is bound down with the adamantine chains of precedent, which has often perverted the plainest principles of justice and common sense. I do not believe there is a single Mason who would not wish to get rid of this rule, but the fraternity entertain a religious horror against defacing the old landmarks. The oaths, therefore, engendered in days of darkness and superstition, must remain the same to the end of time. This circumstance alone is a strong proof of the origin of the order. The practice arises from a stupid adherence to the religious customs and observances of the ancient Egyptians. The mysteries, it has been seen, were deemed a sacred institution, and the most rigid investigation of character, and the severest trials were imposed upon the aspirants to its benefits. No person, says De Paul, who was born with any remarkable bodily imperfection could be consecrated in Egypt, and the very animals, when deformed, were never used either for sacrifice or in symbolical worship. The Levites among the Jews were subjected to the same rigid discipline. No one that had the least bodily blemish could be admitted into the sacerdotal order. As to the admittance of the Levites into the ministry, birth alone did not give it to them. They were likewise obliged to receive a sort of consecration. Take the Levites from among the children of Israel, says God to Moses, and cleanse them. And thus shalt thou do unto them, to cleanse them, sprinkle water of purifying upon them, and let them shave all their flesh, and let them wash their clothes, and so make themselves clean. Then let them take a young bullock, etc. Numbers 7, verse 6. Nor was any Levite permitted to exercise his functions till after he had served a sort of novitiate for 5 years, in which he carefully learned all that related to his ministry. From considering their order, we proceed to consider the manner in which the priests were chosen, and the defects which excluded them from the priesthood. Among the defects of body, which rendered them unworthy of the sacerdotal functions, the Jews reckon up 50%, which are common to men and other animals, and 20 which are peculiar to man alone. The priest whose birth was polluted with any profaneness was clothed in black and sent without the verge of the priest's court, but he who was chosen by the judges appointed for that purpose was clothed in white and joined himself to the other priests. And I know not whether St. John does not allude to this custom when he says, "He that overcometh, the same shall be clothed in white raiment, and I will not blot his name out of the book of life." They whose birth was pure, but who had some defect of body, lived in those apartments of the temple wherein the stores of wood were kept, and were obliged to split and prepare it for keeping up the fire of the altar. There is a remarkable similarity in the institutions of the Egyptians, Jews, and Freemasons. The probation of 4 years was required after initiation into the lesser mysteries, before the candidate could be admitted to a participation of the greater. An entered apprentice in the lodge of Freemasons had formerly to serve 7 years in that grade before he could be advanced. This extra time, however, arose from the necessity of adapting the rules of the order to the craft of masonry, it being the usual period required for apprentices in that and other mechanical trades. The members of the Masonic fraternity also formerly wore white during lodge hours, but at present the white apron alone remains